Big Tony, a black auto shop owner, is harassed by two racist cops. A staged robbery attempt leads to Tony being brutally beaten and framed by the officers. However, the community rallies behind Tony, exposing the officers' lies and forcing them to kneel in a symbolic act of justice. Let's dive into the story proper. The humid Louisiana air hung heavy, thick with the scent of magnolias and simmering tension. A lone figure, Big Tony, leaned against the brick wall of his auto repair shop, his weathered face etched with years of hard living. He watched as a police cruiser slowly rolled down his street, its presence an unwelcome intrusion in the quiet afternoon. Tony knew the drill. He'd seen it countless times before. The way the officers' eyes lingered a little too long, the subtle shift in their posture, the unspoken message that they were watching, always watching. Today, it was Officers Miller and Johnson in the cruiser. Miller, the fresh-faced rookie, eager to prove himself, and Johnson, the seasoned veteran, his face a roadmap of cynicism and weariness. They cruised past Tony's shop, their gazes sweeping over the scene. Tony, a mountain of a man with hands that could fix any engine, met their eyes with a steady gaze of his own. He knew the whispers, the assumptions. Big Tony, the ex-con, the troublemaker. But Tony had paid his dues. He'd served his time and was now a pillar of his community, a mentor to young men who needed guidance, a successful businessman. The cruiser stopped a block away, and the officers stepped out. They straightened their uniforms, adjusted their gear, and started walking towards Tony's shop. Miller, his youthful face a mask of seriousness, fidgeted with his baton. Johnson, his expression unreadable, casually rested his hand on the butt of his gun. Tony watched them approach, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. He knew this dance. He'd danced it too many times before. The subtle power plays, the veiled threats, the unspoken accusations. Just another routine patrol, Johnson muttered, loud enough for Tony to hear. It was a performance, a show of force, meant to intimidate. Tony didn't flinch. He'd faced down worse in his life. He met their gaze, his eyes calm, his posture relaxed but alert. "Afternoon, officers," Tony said, his voice a low rumble. "Anything I can help you with?" "Just checking in, Tony," Johnson replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "Making sure everything's legit." Miller's eyes darted around the shop, taking in the gleaming engines, the neatly organized tools, the posters of classic cars on the walls. He seemed almost disappointed to find everything in order. He was expecting something else, something to justify their presence, something to confirm their preconceived notions. "Everything's fine and dandy, officers," Tony replied, a hint of steel in his voice. "Just like it always is." Johnson smirked. "That's what you say, Tony. But we know you're kind." Tony's jaw tightened. "My kind? And what kind is that, officer?" Johnson chuckled. "You know, the kind that always has something to hide." The tension in the air crackled. Tony's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to relax. He knew what they wanted. They wanted a reaction. They wanted him to lose his cool, to give him a reason, any reason, to escalate the situation. "I got nothing to hide," Tony said, his voice even. "My record's clean. My business is legit. I'm just trying to make an honest living." "Sure you are, Tony," Johnson sneered. "Sure you are?" Miller, sensing the rising tension, stepped forward. "Look, Mr. Tony," he said, trying to sound reasonable. "We just want to ask you a few questions about some recent activity in the neighborhood." Tony raised an eyebrow. "What kind of activity?" "You know," Miller said, avoiding eye contact. "The kind of activity that attracts attention." Tony knew what they were talking about. The recent uptick in petty crime in the area. The broken windows, the graffiti, the small-time drug deals. They were trying to pin it on him, to connect him to something he had nothing to do with. "I don't know anything about that," Tony said. "I'm just trying to run my business." Johnson scoffed. "That's what they all say." The air thickened with hostility. Tony knew this was about more than just a few broken windows. This was about prejudice, about stereotypes, about the ingrained belief that a black man, especially one with a past, was always guilty until proven innocent. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back of the shop. Everyone froze. Tony's eyes narrowed. He knew something was wrong. He had a feeling this was going to escalate, and fast. He had a feeling that this was going to get ugly. The crash echoed through the small shop, a jarring intrusion in the tense standoff. Tony's instincts screamed at him. This wasn't random. This was a setup. He shot a quick glance at the officers, their faces masks of feigned concern. Miller's hand hovered near his holster, his eyes darting nervously towards the back of the shop. Johnson, ever the predator, wore a thin smile, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "What was that?" Miller blurted out, his voice betraying his apprehension. "Stay here," Tony commanded, his voice low and dangerous. He moved with surprising agility for a man his size, his eyes scanning for threats as he cautiously made his way towards the source of the commotion. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. He had to protect his livelihood, his sanctuary. As he rounded the corner, the scene that unfolded before him made his blood run cold. Two figures, clad in dark clothing and ski masks, were ransacking his office. One was frantically stuffing cash and valuables into a bag, while the other stood guard, a crowbar clutched menacingly in his hand. They hadn't expected Tony to come back so soon. Their surprise was evident in their widened eyes and hesitant movements. "Don't move!" Tony roared, his voice booming through the small space. The robbers froze, startled by his sudden appearance. The one with the crowbar lunged at Tony, swinging the weapon with a vicious arc. Tony reacted instinctively, sidestepping the blow and grabbing the man's wrist with a vice-like grip. He twisted, disarming the robber with a sharp jerk. The crowbar clattered to the floor, and the robber yelped in pain. The other robber, seeing his accomplice subdued, hesitated for a moment, then made a dash for the back door. Tony, adrenaline surging through his veins, lunged after him, tackling him to the ground with a bone-jarring thud. A struggle ensued, a chaotic tangle of limbs and grunts. Tony, fueled by rage and a primal need to protect his own, fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion. The commotion drew the attention of the officers. They rushed into the back of the shop, their guns drawn. The sight that greeted them, Tony wrestling with the masked robbers, seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. Without hesitation, Miller barked out orders. "Freeze! Police!" Tony, caught in the heat of the moment, didn't register the commands. He was consumed by the struggle, his focus narrowed to the immediate threat. Johnson, seeing his opportunity, charged forward, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and fury. "Get off him!" he yelled, his voice laced with panic. He grabbed Tony by the shoulder, yanking him back with brutal force. Tony, caught off guard, stumbled and fell. Johnson, his adrenaline pumping, didn't hesitate. He raised his baton and brought it down on Tony's head with a sickening crack. The world exploded in a burst of pain and light. Tony's vision blurred, his ears ringing. He felt himself falling, sinking into a dark abyss. The last thing he saw before darkness consumed him was Johnson's triumphant face, twisted into a mask of hatred and satisfaction. The world swam back into focus, a blurry mess of harsh light and throbbing pain. Tony groaned, his head pounding like a drum. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, unresponsive. He was lying on the cold concrete floor of his shop, his hands cuffed behind his back. Above him, the two officers stood, their faces grim. Johnson, his baton still clutched in his hand, looked down at Tony with a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. Miller, his face pale and drawn, seemed less certain, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "He resisted arrest," Johnson said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Had to subdue him." Miller didn't respond. He knew what he had seen. He had seen Johnson strike Tony with unnecessary force, a brutal blow that had clearly incapacitated him. He also noticed the two masked figures, now subdued and handcuffed, lying nearby. The pieces didn't quite fit. Something felt wrong. "We found these two trying to rob the place," Johnson continued, gesturing towards the robbers. "Looks like Tony was in on it. Probably a setup." Tony, his head still reeling, struggled to make sense of what Johnson was saying. He was being framed. They were trying to pin the robbery on him, to justify their brutal attack. Rage, hot and blinding, surged through him. He tried to speak, to protest his innocence, but his voice was a mere whisper. I didn't. He managed to gasp, his words barely audible. Johnson sneered. Save it, Tony. We've heard it all before. Suddenly, a voice rang out, cutting through the tense atmosphere. What's going on here? A group of people, Tony's neighbors and customers, had gathered outside the shop, drawn by the commotion. They watched with growing concern as the scene unfolded before them. Among them was Ms. Evelyn, a respected community leader and a close friend of Tony's. She pushed her way through the crowd, her face etched with worry. Tony, what happened? She asked, her voice filled with alarm. He's under arrest, Ms. Evelyn, Johnson said, his voice dripping with false authority. Resisting arrest. Assaulting officers. Ms. Evelyn didn't believe it for a second. She knew Tony. She knew his character. He wasn't a violent man. He was a pillar of the community, a man who had turned his life around. That's a lie, she exclaimed, her voice ringing with conviction. Tony would never do that. The crowd murmured in agreement. They knew the truth. They knew that Tony was being targeted, that he was a victim of prejudice and abuse of power. He's being framed, someone shouted from the crowd. They're always targeting him, another voice chimed in. The atmosphere shifted. The crowd, initially hesitant, was now united in their support for Tony. They were tired of the constant harassment, the racial profiling, the injustice. They had had enough. Johnson, sensing the shift in the crowd's mood, started to get nervous. He knew they were losing control of the situation. He looked at Miller, his eyes pleading for backup. But Miller, his conscience finally catching up with him, looked away. Ms. Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. She pointed a finger at Johnson. You think you can get away with this? She demanded. You think we're just going to stand by and watch you abuse Tony like this? The crowd erupted in cheers. They surged forward, surrounding the officers, their voices growing louder and more insistent. Justice for Tony, they chanted. Justice for Tony. Johnson and Miller, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, were forced to retreat. They knew they couldn't win. They knew they had been caught in their lies. They knew that the community wouldn't let them get away with it. Slowly, hesitantly, they knelt down, their heads bowed in shame. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the street. Justice had prevailed. For now, this is just one story, but there are countless others. Share this story, talk about it, and join the fight against racial injustice. Subscribe for more stories that will challenge your perspectives and inspire you to make a difference. Let's work together to create a world where justice is truly blind.